The flickering fluorescent light above the check-in desk hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to the creeping unease that had settled in Elias's bones. He stared out at the empty highway, a black ribbon stretched taut under the indifferent gaze of the moon. The Sunset Rest Motel, a name that felt mocking in its optimism, was nestled in a desolate stretch of Nevada desert, so remote that GPS signals often vanished, leaving travelers stranded and disoriented. Elias had taken the job out of desperation. Fresh out of college with a useless degree in folklore and an even more useless amount of debt, he'd answered an ad promising peaceful solitude and competitive pay. The solitude was definitely delivered. The competitive pay, well, he hadn't seen much of that yet. The owner, a gaunt, perpetually weary man named Mr. Abernathy, had handed him a thick, leather-bound book before leaving. "Everything you need to know is in here," he'd said, his voice raspy like dry leaves skittering across asphalt. "Pay attention, son. This place, it has rules." Elias had flipped through the book. It was filled with rambling, almost nonsensical entries about the history of the motel, the strange occurrences that had plagued it, and various warnings. But buried within the chaotic text were 4 rules, stark and clear against the handwritten scrawl. 1. Never answer the door after midnight. If you hear scratching at the windows, do not acknowledge it. Do not, under any circumstances, go into room 7. If the phone rings and the caller ID says, unknown, do not answer it. Instead, turn off all the lights and hide under the desk until dawn. Elias had initially dismissed them as the eccentric ramblings of an old man. He'd worked plenty of strange jobs, met plenty of strange people. He'd figured he could handle anything. Now, in the dead of night, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the desert, the rules felt less like quirks and more like life-saving instructions. He glanced at the clock above the desk, 11:52 p.m. Just 8 more minutes until the first rule kicked in. He shivered, despite the desert heat that still clung to the air. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a feeling of being watched. He busied himself with straightening the brochures, rearranging the key rack, anything to distract himself. He tried to rationalize his fear. The motel was old, creaky, and isolated. Of course, he was jumpy. It was just the power of suggestion, Abernathy's warnings playing tricks on his mind. 11:58 p.m. He took a deep breath and focused on the sound of the fluorescent light, trying to drown out the rising tide of anxiety. 11:59 p.m. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Midnight. As the clock ticked over, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. Elias jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wind howled around the motel, a mournful, keening sound that seemed to seep into the very walls. He told himself it was just the desert wind, known for its sudden and violent bursts. But the wind felt different, imbued with a malevolence that chilled him to the core. Then he heard it. A soft, hesitant knock on the front door. Elias froze, every muscle in his body tensed. The first rule, never answer the door after midnight. He stared at the door, his mind racing. Maybe it was a lost traveler, someone genuinely in need of help. He could just peek through the peephole, make sure it wasn't someone dangerous. He fought the urge to look. The rule was clear, unambiguous. Abernathy had emphasized it with a chilling intensity that still echoed in Elias's mind. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Hello?" a voice called out, muffled by the thick wooden door. "Is anyone there? I need help." The voice sounded young, desperate. Elias felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't just ignore someone in need. What if it was a family, stranded in the middle of nowhere? He wavered, his hand hovering over the peephole. The voice pleaded again, "Please, I'm begging you. Just open the door." He closed his eyes, picturing Abernathy's gaunt face, his warning clear. He took a step back from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He wouldn't break the rule. He couldn't. The knocking intensified, becoming a frantic pounding accompanied by desperate cries. "Please. My car broke down. I have a child with me. Please, help us." Elias squeezed his eyes shut, willing the sounds to stop. He imagined the child, cold and scared, stranded in the vast emptiness of the desert. The guilt was almost unbearable, but he stood firm, rooted to the spot. He repeated the rule in his head like a mantra: never answer the door after midnight. Never answer the door after midnight. Never answer the door after midnight. After what felt like an eternity, the pounding subsided, the cries faded into the wind. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than the noise had been. Elias remained frozen, his breath held captive in his lungs, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the wind died down. The silence deepened, becoming almost tangible. Elias slowly unclenched his fists, his body trembling. He'd followed the rule. He was safe, for now. He spent the rest of the night huddled behind the check-in desk, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. He imagined faces in the shadows, saw movement in the periphery of his vision. He didn't sleep, paralyzed by fear and guilt. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, a sliver of pink on the horizon, Elias cautiously emerged from his hiding place. He felt drained, exhausted, as if he'd run a marathon. He crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. The desert was empty. No broken-down car, no stranded family, just the endless expanse of sand and scrub. He opened the door slowly, cautiously. Nothing, just the wind whipping through the empty landscape. He stepped outside, scanning the surroundings. He noticed something at the edge of the parking lot, near the tree line. He walked towards it, his heart pounding again. It was a child's doll, lying face down in the dirt. Its porcelain face was cracked, its painted eyes staring blankly up at the sky. Its dress was torn and stained with dirt. Elias picked up the doll, his fingers brushing against its cold, lifeless limbs. A wave of nausea washed over him. He dropped the doll as if it had burned him. He stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. He leaned against it, gasping for breath. What had he done? Had he condemned someone to death by following the rules? He spent the day in a daze, haunted by the memory of the desperate voice and the image of the broken doll. He tried to convince himself that it was all a coincidence, that the family had managed to get help somehow. But deep down, he knew something was wrong, very wrong. The next night arrived with the same oppressive silence, the same creeping dread. Elias was a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound. He reread the rules, his eyes scanning each word, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue to the nature of the evil that lurked within the Sunset Rest Motel. He made it to midnight without incident. He barricaded himself behind the check-in desk, armed with a rusty wrench he'd found in the storage room. The wind picked up again, howling around the building like a tormented spirit. He braced himself, waiting for the inevitable. This time, it wasn't a knock on the door. This time, it was a scratching sound, a persistent, rhythmic scraping against the windows. Elias froze. The second rule: if you hear scratching at the windows, do not acknowledge it. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like claws dragging against the glass, sending shivers down his spine. He squeezed his eyes shut, covering his ears, trying to block out the sound. He imagined grotesque creatures with razor-sharp claws, clawing at the windows, desperate to get in. He pictured their eyes, glowing red in the darkness, filled with malevolent hunger. He fought the urge to look, to peek through the blinds and see what was making the noise. He knew, instinctively, that if he acknowledged the scratching, something terrible would happen. The scratching continued for what seemed like an eternity, a relentless assault on his sanity. He rocked back and forth, whispering to himself, trying to drown out the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise had been. Elias remained huddled behind the desk, his body trembling, listening to the wind howl around the building. He didn't dare move, afraid of what he might see. As dawn approached, the wind began to die down. The silence deepened, becoming almost unbearable. Elias cautiously peeked over the edge of the desk. The windows were streaked with mud and dirt, covered in deep, jagged scratches. He touched one of the scratches, his fingers tracing its sharp edges. He felt a surge of fear, a deep, primal terror. He spent the day cleaning the windows, trying to erase the evidence of the night's ordeal. But the scratches were too deep, too numerous. They were a permanent reminder of the evil that lurked within the walls of the Sunset Rest Motel. He considered leaving. He could pack his bags and run, never look back. But he knew that Abernathy wouldn't let him go that easily. He'd signed a contract, a legally binding agreement that obligated him to stay for at least 6 months. He also knew that leaving would break the rules, and something told him breaking the rules was the worst thing he could do. Besides, he was starting to feel a strange sense of morbid curiosity. What was so special about this place? What was the story behind the rules? He felt compelled to find out, even if it meant risking his life. That night, he braced himself for another onslaught. He reread the rules, focusing on the third one: do not, under any circumstances, go into room 7. He'd avoided room 7 since arriving at the motel. It was located at the end of a long, dark hallway, its door permanently closed. He'd felt an inexplicable sense of dread whenever he passed it, a feeling of overwhelming negativity. He tried to rationalize his fear. It was just a room, like any other room in the motel. It was probably just old and dusty, maybe filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something sinister. As the night wore on, he became increasingly restless. He paced back and forth behind the check-in desk, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of room 7 from his head. He knew he shouldn't do it. He knew it was a trap. But the curiosity was too strong to resist. He had to see what was inside. He grabbed the master key from the key rack, his hand trembling. He took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the desk. The hallway leading to room 7 was dark and cold. The air hung heavy with a sense of foreboding. He walked slowly, cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached room 7, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He could hear a faint whispering sound coming from inside the room, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to seep into his very bones. He reached the door and stopped, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He hesitated, his mind screaming at him to turn back. But the curiosity was too strong. He had to know. He took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. The lock clicked open with a loud, echoing sound that seemed to amplify the silence of the hallway. He slowly pushed open the door and peered inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The air was thick with the stench of decay and mildew. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The room was sparsely furnished, containing only a rusty iron bed frame, a tattered armchair, and a small wooden table. He noticed something on the table. A small, leather-bound book. The same kind of book Abernathy had given him. He cautiously approached the table and picked up the book. Its cover was worn and faded, its pages yellowed and brittle. He opened the book and began to read. The text was written in a spidery, illegible hand, filled with rambling accounts of strange occurrences and disturbing visions. As he read, he felt a growing sense of unease. The words seemed to twist and writhe on the page, forming grotesque images in his mind. He felt a presence in the room, a malevolent entity watching him, waiting. He turned a page and saw something that made his blood run cold. A drawing, crudely sketched in charcoal. It was a drawing of him, standing behind the check-in desk at the Sunset Rest Motel. He slammed the book shut and dropped it on the table. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of here. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a loud bang. He reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked. He pounded on the door, screaming for help, but his voice was swallowed by the thick silence of the room. He was trapped. He turned around, his eyes scanning the room, searching for another way out. He saw something in the corner of the room, hidden in the shadows. A figure. A tall, gaunt figure, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unsettling light. Elias froze, his body paralyzed with fear. The figure slowly emerged from the shadows, its form gradually becoming clearer. It was Abernathy, but it wasn't the Abernathy he knew. This Abernathy was gaunt and emaciated, his skin stretched taut over his bones. His eyes were hollow and black, filled with a malevolent intensity. He smiled, revealing a row of sharp, jagged teeth. "Welcome to room 7, he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I've been expecting you." Elias tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Abernathy slowly approached him, his eyes never leaving his. He reached out a skeletal hand and touched Elias's face. Elias felt a wave of cold wash over him, a sensation of pure, unadulterated evil. He could feel Abernathy's presence invading his mind, probing his thoughts, his fears, his desires. He tried to resist, to fight back, but it was no use. Abernathy was too strong. Abernathy laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the room. "You can't escape," he said. "This room is your prison. You will stay here forever." Elias closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness. He knew he was doomed. He had broken the rule. And now, he would pay the price. He felt Abernathy's presence growing stronger, consuming him, erasing his identity. He was becoming a part of the room, a part of the motel, a part of the evil that lurked within its walls. He opened his eyes and saw his reflection in the grimy window. But it wasn't his reflection he saw. It was Abernathy's. He screamed, but no sound came out. He was trapped, lost, forever bound to room 7. He spent what felt like an eternity in the room, reliving his worst fears, his deepest regrets. He was tortured, tormented, driven to the brink of madness. He eventually lost all sense of time, all sense of self. He was no longer Elias. He was just a shell, a vessel for the evil that resided within room 7. He became a part of the room, a part of the motel, a part of the legend. He became one of the many souls trapped within the walls of the Sunset Rest Motel, forever bound to its dark and sinister secrets. Dawn eventually broke, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the grimy windows of room 7, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was empty. The door was still locked, but the air was thick with a sense of unease, a feeling of overwhelming negativity. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, the shadows seemed to writhe and twist. The room was waiting for its next victim. Back at the check-in desk, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed one word, unknown. Elias's replacement, a young woman named Sarah, stared at the phone, her hand hovering over the receiver. She remembered the fourth rule: if the phone rings and the caller ID says, unknown, do not answer it. Instead, turn off all the lights and hide under the desk until dawn. She felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a feeling of being watched. She glanced around the empty lobby, her heart pounding in her chest. She decided to ignore the rule. It was just a prank call, she told herself. Some kid's playing a joke. She picked up the phone. Sunset Rest Motel, how can I help you? A voice answered, a raspy whisper that sent shivers down her spine. Hello, Sarah. I've been waiting for you. Sarah froze, her eyes widening in terror. She recognized the voice. It was Elias. Elias? Is that you? What's going on? She stammered. The voice laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed in her ears. I'm in room 7, it said. Come join me. Sarah slammed the phone down, her body trembling. She remembered the rule, the warning. She had to hide. She turned off all the lights and dove under the desk, huddling in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the wind howling around the motel, the walls creaking and groaning. She could feel a presence in the room, a malevolent entity watching her, waiting. She closed her eyes, praying for dawn. She knew she was in danger. She knew she had made a mistake. She had answered the phone. And now, she would pay the price. The night stretched on, an eternity of fear and dread. Sarah remained hidden under the desk, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. She could hear voices whispering in the darkness, shadows dancing in the periphery of her vision. She felt a wave of cold wash over her, a sensation of pure, unadulterated evil. She knew she was being watched, hunted. She was trapped, alone, with no hope of escape. As dawn approached, the voices began to fade, the shadows began to dissipate. The wind died down, the silence deepened. Sarah cautiously emerged from her hiding place, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She felt drained, exhausted, as if she had aged a lifetime in a single night. She looked around the lobby, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She was alone. but she knew she wasn't safe. She knew the evil was still there, lurking within the walls of the Sunset Rest Motel, waiting for its next opportunity. She walked to the front door and peered outside. The desert was empty, the sky a pale shade of gray. She stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She felt a sense of relief, a brief moment of peace. Then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, near the tree line. It was Elias. But it wasn't the Elias she knew. This Elias was gaunt and emaciated, his skin stretched taut over his bones. His eyes were hollow and black, filled with a malevolent intensity. He smiled, revealing a row of sharp, jagged teeth. "Welcome to the Sunset Rest Motel," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I hope you enjoy your stay." Sarah screamed and ran, her legs pumping as fast as she could. She didn't look back, didn't dare to stop. She ran until she reached the highway, until she saw a passing car. She flagged it down, begging for help. The driver, a kind-looking woman with a concerned expression, took her to the nearest town. Sarah told her everything, about the rules, about the motel, about Elias. The woman listened patiently, her expression growing increasingly worried. When Sarah finished her story, the woman shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, dear," she said. "But there's no Sunset Rest Motel on this highway. There hasn't been one for years. It burned down a long time ago. Everyone inside perished." Sarah stared at the woman in disbelief. "But I was just there. I saw it. I worked there." The woman shook her head again. "You must have been dreaming, dear. You've probably had a bad experience and it has left you traumatized. There's nothing there now but ruins and whispers." Sarah refused to believe her. She insisted on going back to the site of the motel, to prove that she wasn't crazy. The woman reluctantly agreed. She drove Sarah back to the spot where the Sunset Rest Motel had stood. They arrived at a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but sand and scrub. There was no motel, no parking lot, no tree line. Just ruins. The charred remains of a building, overgrown with weeds and debris. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and decay. Sarah stared at the ruins, her mind reeling. It was all true. The motel was gone. It had never existed. But she remembered everything, the rules, the nights of terror, Elias. She knew she wasn't crazy. She had experienced something real, something terrifying. She looked around the ruins, her eyes searching for something, anything, to confirm her memories. She saw something in the distance, hidden among the rubble. She walked towards it, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a small, leather-bound book. She cautiously picked it up, her fingers trembling. Its cover was worn and faded, its pages yellowed and brittle. She opened the book and began to read. The text was written in a spidery, illegible hand, filled with rambling accounts of strange occurrences and disturbing visions. As she read, she felt a growing sense of unease. The words seemed to twist and writhe on the page, forming grotesque images in her mind. She turned a page and saw something that made her blood run cold. A drawing, crudely sketched in charcoal. It was a drawing of her, standing behind the check-in desk at the Sunset Rest Motel. She slammed the book shut and dropped it on the ground. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned around and ran, her legs pumping as fast as she could. She didn't look back, didn't dare to stop. She ran until she reached the highway, until she was far away from the ruins of the Sunset Rest Motel. She knew she would never forget what she had experienced. She knew she would always be haunted by the memory of the desolate highway, the sinister rules, and the evil that lurked within the burnt remains of the motel. She was sure she saw something from the corner of her eye as she ran away. A gaunt, emaciated figure, smiling. She also knew that the Sunset Rest Motel was still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next victim, hidden from sight, weaving in and out of our dimensions, forever bound to its dark and sinister secrets. And it had rules. You should learn and remember them, because you never know when you might be in the middle of nowhere and stumble upon it.